That is not a puppy." The words left Jack's mouth before he even realized he had spoken them. His hands were trembling, his breath hitched in his throat, and his heart pounded in his chest. The forest was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where he could take a long hike and forget about the stress of the world. Instead, he found himself standing just outside a small clearing, staring at something he couldn't quite comprehend. It had started as a normal enough afternoon. Jack had been hiking these trails since he was a kid, ever since his dad first took him out into the wilds of Washington state. The scent of pine, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird. It was all familiar, all comforting. He knew the trails like the back of his hand, could almost walk them blindfolded. That's why he was certain he hadn't just stumbled upon something ordinary. The dog had been there when he first heard the whimpering. It was a golden retriever mix, its fur matted with dirt and its ribs faintly visible beneath its coat. She was curled up against the base of an old cedar tree, her body heaving with deep breaths as she licked and nuzzled at the tiny creatures wriggling at her side. At first, Jack had felt nothing but relief. A stray mother giving birth was sad, but not unheard of. He had immediately reached for his phone, ready to call the nearest animal rescue. Then he got closer. That's when he saw them. 3 tiny, wet, squirming bodies. 2 of them looked normal. Tiny golden-brown pups, no bigger than the palm of his hand. But the third... Jack's stomach lurched. It wasn't a puppy. At least, not entirely. Its skin was darker, almost leathery, and where the others had short, soft fur, this one had thin, wiry strands that clung to its body. Its ears were too long, stretching out from the sides of its head, and its tiny paws. They had extra toes, more than a puppy should have, more than a dog should have. The mother didn't seem to care. She licked the odd one just as tenderly as the others, nuzzling it closer. The small creature let out a sound, half whimper, half something else entirely. Jack shivered. He wasn't sure why, but he was afraid. Taking a step back, Jack forced himself to think rationally. Maybe it was just a birth defect. Maybe it was nothing. Animals were born with strange mutations all the time. He had seen dogs with missing limbs, cats with extra tails, even a cow once with 2 faces. This was just nature, nothing more. Right? Then the mother lifted her head and locked eyes with him. For a moment, Jack felt rooted to the spot. He had seen dogs look at people before, of course, but there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even wariness. It was almost as if she was asking for something. Help. Jack swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides. His legs told him to turn around, to leave, to let nature take its course. But something deep in his chest wouldn't let him move. He sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped brown hair. "All right, girl," he murmured. "Let's get you and your babies somewhere safe." The mother didn't protest when he knelt beside her. He slipped off his flannel overshirt, using it as a makeshift blanket. One by one, he carefully scooped up the puppies, placing them in the soft fabric. The first 2 were warm, wriggling slightly in protest, but otherwise content. Then came the third one. Jack hesitated. Up close, the differences were even clearer. Its little body was still damp, its breathing a little shallower than its siblings. It twitched in a way that sent a shiver up Jack's spine. But when he finally lifted it into his hands, it made a small sound, a fragile, delicate thing. Helpless. That settled it. Jack tucked the 3 pups safely into his makeshift sling, then carefully lifted the mother into his arms. She was light, far too light for a dog her size. He frowned, wondering how long she had been out here alone, surviving on who knew what. He needed to get them to help. Fast. The hike back to his truck was slow, cautious. Jack knew these trails well, but carrying a mother dog and her newborns down uneven terrain wasn't easy. He had to stop twice. Once when the mother shifted in his arms and let out a soft whimper, and again when he nearly lost his footing on a loose rock. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the glint of his old Ford in the late afternoon sun. Gently, he set the mother and her pups onto the back seat, draping another spare shirt over them to keep them warm. As he started the engine, he glanced once more at the small, strange pup curled up beside its siblings. It looked peaceful now, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Jack exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter. Whatever was going on here, whatever this little creature was, it wasn't his to decide. He just needed to get them somewhere safe. As he pulled onto the road, heading toward the nearest vet clinic, he had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to change everything. Jack's truck rumbled down the quiet back roads, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the trees that lined either side. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the odd little pup to do something unusual, but the litter remained bundled together, their mother resting her head protectively over them. The strange pup was no different from its siblings in that moment, just a tiny, fragile life in need of warmth and care. The nearest vet clinic was in the next town over, nearly 40 minutes away. Jack had called ahead, explaining as much as he could without sounding crazy. The receptionist had been calm, professional, telling him to bring the mother and pups in immediately. But there was hesitation in her voice when he described the 3rd puppy. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "You're just a puppy," he muttered, more to himself than anything. "Just a regular funny-looking puppy." The drive stretched on in silence, save for the occasional whimper from the mother dog. Jack kept an eye on her in the mirror, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was exhausted, her frail body barely moving. He didn't know how long she had been out there, struggling to give birth alone. "Hang in there, girl," he said softly. "We're almost there." When he finally pulled into the clinic's parking lot, he wasted no time. He parked crookedly, grabbed the bundle of pups in his flannel, and carefully lifted the mother from the seat. As he hurried toward the entrance, a vet tech rushed out to meet him, taking the mother dog from his arms and guiding him inside. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a middle-aged woman with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense expression, met him in one of the exam rooms. "Tell me everything," she said, already examining the mother dog as the tech placed her on a padded table. Jack recounted the story quickly. The hike, the clearing, the unusual puppy. He watched as Dr. Carter unwrapped the flannel and inspected the newborns one by one. The first 2 pups received only a quick glance, but when she reached the 3rd, her brow furrowed. She turned the tiny creature over in her gloved hands, pressing gently at its limbs and belly. Jack held his breath. Finally, she let out a quiet hum. "Well, I've never seen anything quite like this." Jack's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's different, but I'm not sure how concerned we should be yet." She placed the pup on the table and pulled out a stethoscope, pressing it gently against its tiny chest. Heartbeat is strong, lungs sound clear. But these features... She trailed off, inspecting the extra toes, the leathery skin beneath its wiry fur. It's definitely canine, but there may be some rare genetic mutation at play. Jack exhaled. So it's okay? Dr. Carter nodded slowly. For now, it's healthy, but we'll need to keep a close eye on it. Mutations like this can sometimes come with internal complications. Jack rubbed his face, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. And the mom? She's weak, underweight, but she should recover with care. You did the right thing bringing them in. The tech stepped forward. Should we keep them overnight, Doc? Dr. Carter glanced at Jack. Are you planning to take them home? Jack hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd just wanted to get them help. But now, looking at the mother dog curled up on the table, her eyes barely open yet still filled with trust, he knew he couldn't just leave them. I'll take them, he said before he could second-guess himself. Dr. Carter gave him a small smile. Then I'll send you home with formula and supplies. We'll need to do follow-ups, especially for the little one. Jack nodded. By the time he left the clinic, he had a box lined with blankets on the passenger seat, the mother dog resting inside with her pups nestled against her. He had a bag of supplies, a list of care instructions, and Dr. Carter's number in case of emergencies. As he drove home, a strange feeling settled in his chest. He had set out on a simple hike that day, expecting nothing more than fresh air and exercise. Now he was bringing home a family, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the change. Jack's house sat on the edge of town, tucked away from the busy streets, surrounded by a dense patch of trees. It wasn't much, just a small single-story place with a worn porch and a backyard that stretched into the woods. He pulled into the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the familiar shape of his home, before cutting the engine. For a moment, he sat there, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the quiet hum of the night outside. He glanced at the box on the passenger seat. The mother dog had barely moved since they left the clinic, her body curled protectively around the 3 pups. He could hear their tiny squeaks as they nestled close to her warmth. Jack exhaled slowly. All right, he muttered. Let's get you guys inside. Carrying the box carefully, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping into the familiar space of his living room. It smelled of wood and old coffee, the result of too many mornings spent with a cup in hand and a newspaper he barely read. He set the box down near the couch, reaching for one of the blankets draped over the armrest. He folded it gently, placing it inside the box for extra warmth. The mother dog lifted her head slightly, her tired eyes watching him. He crouched beside her, offering a slow, reassuring hand. She didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to relax. You're safe now, Jack said quietly. You and your babies. He stood up and headed toward the kitchen, pulling out the supplies Dr. Carter had given him. Formula, syringes for feeding in case the mother struggled, and a set of small bowls. He filled one with fresh water and placed it beside the box before grabbing a can of soft dog food. As soon as he peeled back the lid, the mother dog perked up. Hungry? Jack asked. He scooped some food into the bowl and slid it toward her. She hesitated only for a second before leaning forward, lapping it up with slow, deliberate bites. Jack watched, relieved that she still had an appetite. It meant she had fight left in her. He sat back, stretching his legs out, watching as the puppies shifted slightly against their mother. The odd little one was curled between its 2 siblings, its breathing steady. Jack found himself staring again. He still didn't know what to make of it. It was a puppy, that much was clear, but its features set it apart in a way he couldn't shake. Jack rubbed his face. Maybe it didn't matter. It was here now, and it needed care just like the others. The next few hours passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Jack kept checking on the mother and her pups, making sure they were comfortable. He tried to do some reading, but found himself distracted, his eyes drifting back to the box every few minutes. Eventually, exhaustion won. He grabbed an old pillow and lay down on the floor beside them, letting sleep pull him under. He woke to soft whimpering. Jack blinked, groggy, pushing himself upright. The room was dim, early morning light barely creeping through the windows. He rubbed his eyes before focusing on the sound. It was coming from the box. The mother dog was awake, her body tense, her head lowered over her pups. Jack moved closer, heart kicking up. The two normal-looking puppies were curled against her belly, content. But the odd one, it was wriggling, making the softest, strangest sounds. Jack frowned. "Hey, little guy," he murmured. As if in response, the pup twitched, its tiny limbs stretching awkwardly. Then, for the first time, it opened its eyes. Jack stiffened. Newborn puppies typically took weeks before their eyes opened. But this one, its eyes were wide, unfocused, an unnatural shade of dark amber. Jack's breath caught. The pup blinked slowly, its tiny mouth opening as if trying to make a sound beyond the faint whimpers. Jack swallowed hard. "That's not normal," he muttered under his breath. The mother dog gave a low, reassuring lick to the pup's head, nudging it closer. Jack hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing gently against its small body. The moment his skin touched its fur, an odd sensation ran through him. Warm, almost like a subtle static shock. Not painful, just strange. He pulled back instinctively. His heart was racing now, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. The puppy didn't seem bothered, though. It just curled into the warmth of its mother, its odd little eyes blinking once before shutting again. Jack let out a slow breath. Maybe he was imagining things. He hadn't exactly gotten a full night's sleep. He rubbed his hands together, shaking off the strange feeling. The pup was fine. That was all that mattered. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his back, and headed toward the kitchen to make coffee. He needed a clear head. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. Jack stuck to his usual routine, feeding the mother, checking on the pups, making calls for work. But no matter what he did, his thoughts kept circling back to the little one. Something about it gnawed at him, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. By late afternoon, he decided he needed answers. Jack grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Carter's number. He hesitated for only a second before hitting call. She picked up after 2 rings. "Jack, everything all right?" He exhaled. "Yeah, sort of. Something weird happened with the puppy. The odd one." Dr. Carter's voice was calm. "Weird how?" Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Its eyes, they opened this morning. And I don't know. I touched it and felt this." He stopped, trying to find the right words. "It was like a small shock. Not painful, just different." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "That's unusual. Newborns shouldn't open their eyes that early. And the shock. Are you sure it wasn't static?" Jack shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "It didn't feel like normal static. It was warm. Hard to explain." Dr. Carter hummed thoughtfully. "I'd like to take another look at it. Can you bring them in tomorrow?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, first thing." "Good. Keep an eye on it in the meantime. Let me know if anything else happens." Jack ended the call, staring at his phone for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the box. The puppies were still nestled together, unaware of his growing unease. Jack sighed. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe he was just tired, letting his imagination get the better of him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening with this puppy, it was just the beginning. Jack didn't sleep much that night. He tried, but every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts looped back to the puppy. He would hear the soft whimpers from the box, feel that strange sensation again as he remembered the moment he touched it. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. Eventually, he gave up. By dawn, he was already moving, pacing the length of his small house, his coffee going cold on the table. The mother dog was awake too, watching him from where she lay curled around her pups. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. Guess neither of us got much sleep, huh? She flicked her tail slightly, eyes half-lidded, but she wasn't tense. She wasn't afraid. That was a good sign. Jack checked the time. The clinic didn't open for another 2 hours. He had already planned to bring them in first thing, but now that the moment was nearing, something gnawed at him. Would Dr. Carter even know what to do? She had sounded uncertain last night, and Jack didn't blame her. This wasn't exactly something you read about in veterinary textbooks. Still, sitting around wouldn't help. He grabbed his keys, then carefully lifted the box, keeping the pups wrapped snug in their blanket. The mother dog didn't protest, just adjusted slightly so that she could see them all. Jack had already set up the passenger seat with another blanket to keep them from shifting too much, and once he had them settled, he started the truck and backed out of the driveway. The drive was quiet, the early morning roads mostly empty. Jack kept his focus ahead, but his thoughts drifted. He had grown up around animals. His dad had always kept dogs, mutts mostly, the kind you found wandering the back roads. He had seen plenty of litters, helped take care of them, even nursed a sick pup or two back to health. But he had never seen anything like this. By the time he pulled up to the clinic, the sun was rising higher, casting golden light across the parking lot. He climbed out quickly and grabbed the box, keeping it steady as he pushed through the doors. Dr. Carter was already there, waiting. She motioned for him to follow her into an exam room, where she gestured for him to set the box on the table. "All right," she said, pulling on gloves. "Let's take another look." Jack stepped back, crossing his arms as she carefully unwrapped the pups. The first two were normal, small, soft, warm, but the third... Dr. Carter lifted the odd puppy with gentle hands, turning it slightly. Its tiny limbs twitched, its dark amber eyes blinking up at her. She let out a thoughtful hum, then reached for a small light. "Still fully open," she murmured, shining the light near its pupils. "But reactive." Jack watched as she ran her fingers over its body, checking its joints, feeling along its tiny ribs. Then she hesitated, frowning slightly. "What?" Jack asked, his voice a little too sharp. Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. She carefully spread the pup's front paw, her brow furrowing. "Its bones feel different," she said finally. "Not bad, necessarily. Just different. Slightly denser than they should be at this stage." Jack shifted. "What does that mean?" Dr. Carter set the pup down gently, watching as it curled back into the blanket. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "It's not unhealthy, from what I can tell. It's eating, breathing normally, but whatever mutation this is, it's not something I've encountered before." Jack exhaled. He hadn't expected an answer, not really, but he had hoped for one. Dr. Carter removed her gloves and folded her arms. "I can run some tests, blood work, imaging. It would give us a better idea of what we're dealing with." Jack hesitated. He wasn't sure why. But something in him balked at the idea. Maybe it was the way the mother dog was watching him, her eyes steady and calm. Maybe it was just instinct. But the idea of putting this tiny, fragile pup through medical tests so soon didn't sit right with him. "Let's hold off on that for now," he said finally, "unless there's a reason to be concerned." Dr. Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I want regular checkups. Weekly, if possible." Jack nodded. That he could agree to. By the time he left the clinic, he felt marginally better. The pup wasn't sick. It wasn't in danger. It was just different. That was something he could handle. The ride home was quiet, the mother dog resting her head near the box as if reassured by Jack's presence. He pulled into his driveway, carried them inside, and set them back in their designated corner of the living room. Then, for the first time in nearly 24 hours, he let himself breathe. Days passed, and Jack fell into a new routine. The mother dog, whom he started calling Daisy, continued to recover, gaining back some of the weight she had lost. The two normal pups thrived, growing stronger with each passing day, and the third... Jack watched it closely. It was growing, just like its siblings, but there was something different about how it moved. It was more alert, more aware. It would stare at Jack with those amber eyes, blinking slowly, like it was trying to figure something out. And then there were the moments, small, fleeting things, that made Jack pause. The pup would shiver just slightly when Jack touched it, that odd warmth still lingering between them. It was always subtle, always brief, but enough to make his skin prickle. Then there were the noises. Not quite barks, not quite whimpers, something in between, something different. Jack tried to push it aside. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was just looking too hard. But then one night, something happened that he couldn't ignore. It was late. Jack had dozed off on the couch, his book slipping from his hands. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft breathing of Daisy and her pups. Then, something shifted. A faint hum in the air. A barely perceptible change. Jack stirred, his eyes flickering open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight through the window. He turned his head slightly and froze. The odd puppy was awake, sitting up in the box. Its eyes weren't just open. They were glowing. Jack's breath caught. He blinked, once, twice, telling himself he was imagining it. But no, the pup's amber eyes shone in the dim light, faint but undeniable. Jack sat up slowly, his heart pounding. The pup tilted its head, watching him. Then, just as quickly as it had happened, the glow faded. The pup let out a tiny yawn, curled back against its siblings, and went still. Jack didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, staring at the little creature in the box, a slow, uneasy realization creeping over him. Whatever this puppy was, it wasn't just different. It was something else entirely. Jack didn't sleep after that. He sat awake on the couch, eyes locked onto the small box where the mother and her pups rested. The little one, whatever it was, had curled back up, as if nothing had happened. But Jack had seen it. The faint glow in its eyes, the way it had sat so still, watching him. It wasn't normal. For the first time since finding them, doubt crept in. What had he brought home? The house was still, the only sounds the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shifting of the mother dog. Jack forced himself to breathe evenly, to calm down. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the glow had been a trick of the light. He was exhausted, running on barely any sleep, his mind playing tricks on him. That had to be it. And yet he didn't look away from the box for the rest of the night. By morning, the house was filled with soft, golden light streaming through the windows. The normalcy of it almost made Jack laugh. Almost. Daisy stretched, licking her pups as they squirmed, blind and helpless. The odd one among them twitched in its sleep. Completely unaware of Jack's unease, he rubbed his hands over his face. He needed to get out of the house for a bit, clear his head. Jack grabbed his jacket and keys, hesitating for just a moment before moving toward Daisy. "I'll be back soon, girl," he murmured, scratching her gently behind the ears. She gave him a slow blink, her body relaxed. If she wasn't worried, maybe he shouldn't be either. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The trees rustled slightly, the world still waking up. He got in his truck and pulled onto the road, heading toward the one place he knew might help him make sense of all this: Dr. Carter's clinic. The parking lot was mostly empty when he arrived. He walked inside, the bell above the door chiming. The receptionist gave him a familiar nod. "Jack, didn't expect you back so soon. Is Dr. Carter in?" "Should be finishing up an appointment. I'll let her know you're here." Jack sat in the waiting area, bouncing his knee impatiently. It wasn't long before Dr. Carter stepped out, wiping her hands on a paper towel. She raised an eyebrow at him. "You didn't waste any time, did you?" Jack stood. "I need to talk." She nodded, leading him back into the same exam room they had been in just the day before. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "All right, what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" Jack hesitated, trying to find the right words. "The pup. The odd one. Something happened last night." Dr. Carter frowned. "What kind of something?" He exhaled. Its eyes, they glowed. She blinked, clearly waiting for him to say more. When he didn't, she pushed off the counter. "Glowed?" "Yeah." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "I woke up and it was just sitting there, staring at me, and its eyes were glowing. Not reflecting light, actually glowing." Dr. Carter studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Jack," she said carefully, "are you sure you weren't just half asleep? Puppy's eyes can sometimes catch light." "I wasn't imagining it," he interrupted. "I know what I saw." She sighed. "All right, let's say for argument's sake that this happened exactly how you remember. What do you think it means?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know. That's why I'm here." Dr. Carter was silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, bring the pup in later today. I'll do some closer examinations." Jack hesitated. "I don't want to stress it out. I won't do anything invasive. Just another check. Maybe there's a logical explanation." Jack wasn't sure he believed that, but he nodded. "I'll bring it by this afternoon." The drive back home felt longer than usual. When he stepped inside, he half expected to find something different, but everything was as he left it. Daisy lifted her head slightly in greeting before settling back down, her pups huddled close to her belly. Jack crouched beside the box, watching them. The odd one was still there, still tiny and fragile, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't like the others. When afternoon rolled around, he gently lifted the pup and wrapped it in a soft towel, making sure to keep it warm. Daisy whined slightly but didn't protest. Jack stroked her head. "Just for a little while, girl. I'll bring it back." The clinic was busier when he returned. Dr. Carter led him into an exam room, taking the small bundle from his hands. Jack watched as she unwrapped it, the tiny pup blinking up at her with those dark amber eyes. She ran through her checks again, methodical and focused, checked its heartbeat, its reflexes, its paws. Then she paused. Jack tensed. What? Dr. Carter touched a small area near the pup's ribs, frowning. Jack, its temperature is higher than normal. Jack's stomach tightened. How much higher? She grabbed a small digital thermometer, gently placing it against the pup's tiny body. A few seconds later, it beeped. Dr. Carter looked at the reading, her frown deepening. Higher than it should be, but it's not acting sick. Jack stared at the pup. It squirmed slightly in her hands, but it wasn't distressed, just aware. Dr. Carter exhaled. I don't know what's causing this. It's still eating, still growing. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but this isn't something I've seen before. Jack felt a cold weight settle in his chest. So what do we do? Dr. Carter wrapped the pup back up, handing it to him. For now, we watch. Track its development. If anything changes, anything at all, bring it back immediately. Jack nodded, adjusting his grip on the tiny body. He didn't like this. He didn't like not knowing. The drive home was quiet. When he stepped back inside, Daisy immediately perked up, her tail thumping against the blanket. Jack knelt beside her, placing the pup carefully back into the warmth of the nest. Daisy sniffed it, licking its tiny head before settling back down. Jack sat there for a long time, watching, waiting. Days passed, and the pup continued to grow. Its fur became thicker, darker. Its eyes remained wide and aware, watching everything. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, Jack would wake to find it staring at him again. It never cried, never whimpered like its siblings, just watched. And deep down, Jack knew. Whatever this puppy was, it wasn't just different. It was something else entirely. Jack had always considered himself a rational man. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, and he definitely wasn't the kind to let his imagination get the better of him. But after another week of watching the strange puppy grow, he couldn't deny that something about it was beyond explanation. The other two pups were growing at a normal rate, their small bodies filling out, their fur soft and golden like their mother's. But the odd one, Jack was starting to think of it as Ember because of its strange amber eyes, was developing differently. Its fur was darker now, almost charcoal gray, and it moved in ways that were too precise for a puppy that young. It didn't stumble or fumble when it tried to stand. It didn't whimper when it lost balance. It just learned quickly. Jack watched one morning as Ember, barely 2 weeks old, wobbled onto unsteady legs and locked eyes with him from the box. Most puppies struggled to walk at that age, but Ember was standing with an eerie sort of control. Jack felt his chest tighten as those strange eyes blinked up at him, unblinking, aware. He crouched next to the box. "You're something else, aren't you?" Ember cocked its small head, then did something that made Jack's breath catch. It took a step. Not the usual, uncoordinated shuffle of a newborn pup, but a real, deliberate step toward him. Then another. And another. By the time Jack realized what was happening, Ember had climbed over its sleeping siblings and was sitting at the edge of the box, staring up at him. A 2-week-old pup should not be able to do that. Jack swallowed hard. His first instinct was to call Dr. Carter. But what could he even say? "Hey, the weird puppy is moving like a dog 3 times its age?" She already thought he was overly anxious. If he kept showing up with vague, strange observations, she might start thinking he had lost it. Jack exhaled and leaned back against the couch. "All right, buddy. Let's see where this goes." Over the next few days, he kept a closer watch. The two normal pups were thriving, playful and lazy in the way all young puppies were. Daisy took care of them, never leaving their side for too long. But Ember continued to stand out. It started tracking movement before its eyes should have even fully developed their depth perception. It responded to sound with a precision that made Jack uneasy. And the warmth Jack had felt that first day, the subtle heat that pulsed through its small body, hadn't gone away. One night, as Jack sat by the fireplace, he felt it again. Ember had wandered away from its siblings, padding toward Jack's outstretched hand. When its tiny paws touched his skin, a faint but noticeable heat passed between them, as if the pup was warmer than it should be. Not feverish, just heated. Jack inhaled sharply and lifted his hand away. Ember tilted its head, its glowing amber eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers. The next morning, Jack called Dr. Carter. "I need you to see the pup again," he said, trying to keep his voice even. There was a pause on the other end. "Jack, is something wrong?" Jack exhaled. "Just something's different. I need you to take another look." Dr. Carter agreed to meet him that afternoon. When Jack loaded Ember into a towel-lined crate and drove to the clinic, he kept glancing down at the small creature curled inside. Ember wasn't nervous. In fact, it almost looked like it knew exactly where they were going. Jack clenched the steering wheel. That wasn't normal. None of this was. When he arrived, Dr. Carter led him straight to an exam room. "All right," she said, slipping on a pair of gloves. "What's changed?" Jack lifted Ember onto the table. "Watch." Dr. Carter frowned, leaning closer as Ember stood, really stood, on the table, balanced and controlled. She glanced at Jack. "That's early." Jack nodded. "It's not just that. It doesn't move like a normal puppy. It doesn't stumble. It doesn't struggle. It's aware." Dr. Carter picked Ember up, gently checking its joints, its heartbeat, its temperature. She paused. "Still running warm." Jack nodded. "I know." She set the pup down again, and Ember immediately sat, blinking up at her with those strange, intelligent eyes. Dr. Carter exhaled. "Jack, I won't lie to you. This isn't normal, but it's not unhealthy either. I can run more tests, but I don't know if I'll find anything. Some genetic mutations can cause rapid development, but this level of awareness? It's unusual." Jack crossed his arms. "And the heat?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "I don't know." Jack felt his pulse quicken. "So what do I do?" Dr. Carter studied Ember for a long moment before finally saying, "You keep watching, and if anything else changes, you bring it back." Jack nodded, lifting Ember back into the crate. The drive home was silent, tension coiling in Jack's chest. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sun was setting. He carried Ember back inside, setting it carefully next to its siblings. The other pups barely stirred, but Ember remained awake, blinking up at him. Jack let out a slow breath. "What are you?" Ember didn't respond, but as Jack sat back against the couch, watching the pup settle in, he swore he felt that warmth again, faint but steady, like a quiet ember burning just beneath the surface. And for the first time since finding them in the woods, Jack realized that whatever had started that day, it wasn't over. Jack spent the next week in a strange state of both fascination and unease. Ember wasn't just growing. Ember was learning, faster than any dog Jack had ever seen. The other two puppies still waddled clumsily, tripping over their own paws as they tried to explore beyond their mother's warmth. But Ember? Ember was different. It watched, it studied, and then it acted with a precision that wasn't normal. Jack first noticed it when he was refilling Daisy's water bowl. As soon as the water splashed in, Ember turned its head sharply, ears twitching at the sound. It stood up, easily, without the wobble of an uncoordinated pup, and walked straight toward the bowl. Not stumbled. Walked. Jack crouched, watching as Ember sniffed the water before dipping its tiny mouth to drink. The other puppies, still blind to most of the world, weren't doing that yet. They weren't ready. But Ember was. Jack exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "You're not normal, are you?" he murmured. Ember blinked up at him, tilting its head slightly. Jack felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not quite, but something close to awe. By the time the puppies reached their third week, the difference became undeniable. The others were growing well, chubby, playful, beginning to bark in short, high-pitched yips. Ember, however, barely made a sound. It moved with purpose, always aware of where it was going. And then there were the moments, small, fleeting things that made Jack pause. One evening, as he sat on the floor, watching them, Ember climbed out of the box on its own. It wasn't a clumsy escape like the others had attempted. It was calculated. It gripped the edge of the box with its tiny paws, tested the weight, and then climbed over smoothly, landing softly on the floor. Jack's breath hitched. That's not something you should be able to do yet." The pup padded toward him, sitting at his knee. Then, as if this was all perfectly natural, it placed one tiny paw on his leg. The warmth returned immediately. That same quiet heat, not burning, not painful, but undeniably there. Jack swallowed hard. "What are you?" Ember didn't react, only blinked up at him. Daisy, who had been resting nearby, suddenly lifted her head, her gaze settling on Ember. For the first time, Jack saw something like recognition in her eyes. Not alarm, not confusion, just knowing. Jack reached down, hesitating, before gently placing his hand against Ember's back. The warmth pulsed through his palm, spreading through his fingers. It wasn't natural, but it wasn't threatening either. He exhaled slowly. "You don't belong here, do you?" Ember let out a soft sound. Not a bark, not a whimper. Something between the two. Then it climbed into Jack's lap, curling into a small, compact shape. Jack sat there for a long time, staring down at the strange, warm creature that had somehow become part of his life. That night, something woke him. The house was dark, quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of trees outside. Jack sat up on the couch, his mind sluggish with sleep. Then he felt it, that odd shift in the air. He turned his head slowly, eyes adjusting to the dim light from the moon outside. Ember was awake. Sitting in the middle of the room, completely still, its amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of the night. Jack's pulse quickened. "Ember?" The pup didn't move, but something about the way it sat, the way it watched, it felt wrong. Jack swallowed hard and rubbed his hands over his face. All right, I need sleep. I'm losing it. He forced himself to lie back down, though the feeling in his gut didn't fade. It wasn't fear, exactly, but it was something close. When morning came, everything was normal again. Ember curled up with its siblings, Daisy licked them affectionately, and Jack almost convinced himself he had imagined the whole thing. Almost. Another week passed, and Jack realized he needed help. Not from Dr. Carter. She had already told him everything she could. No, this was beyond her expertise. He needed to know if there was anyone else, anyone who had seen something like this before. Jack sat at his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He hesitated. Then finally he typed, "Newborn puppy developing too fast?" He scrolled through results, most of them generic articles about puppy growth. Nothing unusual, nothing helpful. He tried again. Puppy with glowing eyes? Still nothing. Jack let out a frustrated breath. He needed to be smarter about this. He needed to describe what he had seen without making it sound like he was losing his mind. He tried again. Puppy developing early with strange abilities. This time, something caught his eye. A forum post. Old, buried under pages of search results. But the title made Jack's stomach clench. Has anyone ever found a dog that wasn't really a dog? He clicked on it. The post was written by someone named Nate B92, nearly 5 years ago. Jack skimmed the words, his heartbeat picking up. I found a dog once, or at least I thought it was a dog, but it was too smart. Too aware, it barely made a sound, but it always watched. And sometimes I swore it could understand more than it should. I tried to explain it to people, but no one believed me. Then one day, it just disappeared. Jack's hands tightened around the mouse. He scrolled further, finding a few responses. Most were jokes, dismissing the post as nonsense. But one reply, buried near the bottom, made Jack's skin crawl. You should have never taken it home. Jack pushed back from the laptop, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on Ember, who was curled up peacefully by the fireplace. Jack exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. All right, Jack, get a grip. It's just a dog. A weird dog, sure, but still a dog. But the words felt hollow, even as he said them. He looked back at the screen, rereading the last reply. You should have never taken it home. Jack closed the laptop. He wasn't ready for that thought. Not yet. Instead, he turned his attention back to Ember, who was still sleeping soundly. Normal. Safe. Innocent. And yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he didn't understand. The days that followed were marked by an odd, quiet tension. Jack went about his routine, feeding Daisy, playing with the 2 normal pups, and keeping an ever-watchful eye on Ember. He tried not to let his unease show, even as the differences between Ember and the others grew more pronounced. While the other 2 puppies were still fumbling over each other, Ember moved with deliberate, calculated steps. It was as if it knew exactly what it wanted and how to get there. It didn't yip or bark like the others. Instead, it made quiet, almost musical sounds, soft and strange, that seemed to resonate in Jack's ears long after they stopped. Jack found himself spending hours just watching Ember. It wasn't just the way it moved or the odd sounds it made. It was the way it seemed to understand him. When Jack spoke, Ember's head would tilt at just the right moment, as if it was following every word. It would meet his eyes in a way that no animal ever had, like it was looking past him, into him. Daisy didn't seem bothered. She treated Ember the same as the others, licking and nuzzling it with motherly care. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Daisy knew something he didn't. One evening, as Jack sat by the fireplace with a book, Ember padded over and sat directly in front of him. Jack looked down, meeting those glowing amber eyes. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly. Ember tilted its head, that same faint hum in the air around it. Jack felt the warmth again, a subtle heat radiating from the small creature. He reached out hesitantly, resting his hand on its back. The warmth pulsed once, steady and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Jack withdrew his hand, leaning back in his chair. "You're not normal," he said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Ember blinked slowly, then turned and walked away, back to the box where its siblings were curled up. Jack watched it go, feeling a weight in his chest that he couldn't explain. The next morning, Jack decided he needed to do something. Sitting around, waiting for answers that wouldn't come, wasn't going to help. He called Dr. Carter. "Dr. Carter, it's Jack. I need to bring Ember in again." Her voice was calm, but he could hear the concern. "What's going on?" Jack hesitated. It's different. More than before. I think you need to see it again." She agreed, and that afternoon Jack packed Ember into the crate and drove to the clinic. The whole way there, he kept glancing at the small creature, half expecting it to do something extraordinary. But Ember sat quietly, its eyes watching the trees blur past the window. At the clinic, Dr. Carter met him in the exam room. Jack placed Ember on the table and stepped back. "Just watch," he said. Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, but began her examination. She checked Ember's weight, its temperature, its reflexes. All the while, Ember remained still, its eyes locked on hers. "It's growing faster than expected," she said, her tone neutral. "And that warmth you mentioned? It's definitely there." Jack crossed his arms. "What does it mean?" Dr. Carter shook her head. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this. It's healthy, but it's unusual." Jack's frustration bubbled up. "So what do I do?" Dr. Carter met his gaze. "For now, keep observing. If anything changes, anything at all, bring it back." Jack nodded, though the lack of answers gnawed at him. He scooped Ember back into the crate and left the clinic feeling more uncertain than ever. That night, as Jack sat on the porch, the cool evening air wrapping around him, he tried to think through what had happened. Ember was healthy, according to Dr. Carter, but that didn't explain the glowing eyes, the unnatural awareness, or the warmth. It didn't explain the way it seemed to understand him in a way no animal should. He looked out at the dark woods beyond his yard, the same woods where he had found Daisy and the pups. For the first time, he wondered if there was something in those woods that he didn't understand, something that had changed Ember before it was born. Jack shook his head. "I'm losing it," he muttered. But the unease didn't leave. The next few days passed slowly. Jack tried to focus on normal things: work, chores, making sure Daisy and the pups were well fed. But no matter what he did, Ember was always there. A quiet, watchful presence that he couldn't ignore. One night, as Jack was washing dishes, he heard a soft, melodic sound from the living room. He froze, his hands still under the warm water. The sound wasn't barking. It wasn't whining. It was something else entirely. Low, musical, and strangely beautiful. Jack turned off the faucet and wiped his hands on a towel. He stepped into the living room, his heart pounding. Ember was sitting in the middle of the floor, its head tilted back slightly, eyes half closed. The sound was coming from it, a gentle hum that filled the room. Jack stared, unable to move. The other pups were asleep in the box, and Daisy was resting nearby. None of them seemed to notice the sound. It was just Jack and Ember, locked in this strange, shared moment. As the hum faded, Ember lowered its head and looked directly at Jack. The glow in its eyes was brighter than before, pulsing gently in the dim light. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. Ember wasn't just a puppy. It was something else entirely. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Ember's presence was shifting something within him. Not fear, not entirely. It was more like a constant hum at the back of his mind, a subtle yet unrelenting reminder that whatever this small, warm creature was, it wasn't like the others. He tried to keep his days normal, feeding Daisy and the pups, chopping wood for the stove, and tinkering with the old truck in his driveway, but he always found his thoughts drifting back to Ember. There was no avoiding it now. Ember was not just another puppy. The glowing eyes, the heat that radiated from its small body, the way it moved with a grace that no young pup should have. All of it added up to something Jack couldn't ignore. And yet, he didn't feel the urge to push the pup away or abandon it. If anything, Jack felt a strange protectiveness toward Ember, as if he were responsible for understanding whatever this was, for keeping it safe. As the days passed, Ember's behavior grew more peculiar. It wasn't just the physical differences. Ember seemed to understand things Jack hadn't taught it, things that went beyond instinct. Jack started to notice patterns. If he moved a piece of furniture, Ember would pause in the middle of the room, head tilted, as if memorizing the new layout. If Jack left the room and returned, Ember would always be sitting just inside the doorway, watching quietly. It wasn't just following him out of curiosity. It was waiting. One morning, Jack decided to test it. He set a small toy, a rubber ball Daisy had long ignored, on the floor. Ember padded over to it, sniffed it once, and then looked up at Jack. "Go on," Jack said, nudging the ball slightly. "Play with it." Ember didn't move. It blinked those amber eyes, then reached out one paw to tap the ball. The tap wasn't clumsy or playful. It was deliberate, as if testing the ball's weight and texture. Then it nudged the ball back toward Jack. Jack frowned. "What are you doing?" Ember tilted its head, a soft, musical sound escaping its mouth, a sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a whimper. It was something in between, something otherworldly. Jack crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not just playing, are you?" Ember stepped closer, the ball forgotten. It placed one small paw on Jack's hand, and there it was again. That warmth. Not hot, not unpleasant, but undeniably present. Jack felt it spreading through his skin, up his arm, and into his chest. He pulled back instinctively. "What are you?" Ember didn't answer, of course. It simply sat there, watching. Jack stood up and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, I'll bite. If you're so smart, let's see how smart you really are." He retrieved a cardboard box from the corner of the room and set it on the floor. It was empty, just large enough for Ember to climb into. Jack then grabbed a smaller object, a wooden spoon, and placed it beside the box. "Bring me the spoon," he said, pointing at it. Ember cocked its head, but didn't move. "Come on, you understand me, don't you?" The pup blinked, then took a step forward. It nudged the spoon with its nose, then looked back at Jack. "That's it. Bring it here." After a moment, Ember picked up the spoon carefully in its small jaws and carried it to Jack's feet. Jack crouched down, taking the spoon and staring at Ember in disbelief. "How did you?" he muttered. Ember sat patiently, its eyes calm and steady. There was no excitement, no wagging tail, just an expectant look, as if waiting for the next step. Jack's heart was pounding. He knew dogs were intelligent. Daisy was smart in her own way, but this was different. This wasn't training. This wasn't instinct. This was something else. He spent the rest of the day watching Ember closely, trying to understand what made the pup tick. The other two puppies were thriving, playful and clumsy, completely normal in every way. But Ember seemed to know more than it should. That night, Jack lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, except for the occasional soft rustle of Daisy shifting in her sleep. Jack's mind churned with questions he couldn't answer. Where had Ember really come from? What had happened in those woods? Was this just some bizarre mutation, or was it something more? Jack closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. For now, Ember was here, safe and healthy. Whatever the pup was, it didn't seem dangerous, just different, and Jack would figure it out one way or another. The following days brought more surprises. Ember began to interact with its surroundings in ways that felt eerily deliberate. It wasn't just moving through the house, it was navigating it. Every step seemed calculated, every glance thoughtful. And when Jack spoke to it, Ember responded. Not with words, obviously, but with small movements and soft sounds that seemed like answers. Jack started testing these responses. "Ember, are you hungry?" The pup would tilt its head slightly, then walk toward the food bowl. "Do you want to go outside?" Ember would step to the door, sitting patiently until Jack opened it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as time went on, Jack couldn't deny that Ember understood him. Not just words, but intent. It was as if the pup was reading him, picking up on signals that no normal dog would recognize. One evening, Jack decided to see just how far this understanding went. He sat down on the floor, legs crossed, and placed 3 objects in front of him: the rubber ball, a rolled-up sock, and the wooden spoon. "Ember," he said, keeping his tone calm and clear, "bring me the sock." Ember stared at him for a moment, then walked over to the sock. It hesitated briefly, then picked it up in its jaws and carried it back to Jack. Jack's stomach tightened. "All right, now the ball." Ember set down the sock, turned to the ball, and nudged it toward him. "Good. Now the spoon." Again, Ember followed the command, picking up the spoon and placing it gently at Jack's feet. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "You're not normal," he murmured. Ember simply blinked up at him, silent and composed. Jack leaned back, staring at the small, dark-furred pup that seemed to defy everything he knew about dogs. He didn't know what Ember was, or how it could do what it did. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary animal. And as much as Jack wanted to believe otherwise, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had started in those woods wasn't over. Jack's world had grown oddly small. Each day began and ended with the same question. What was Ember? He couldn't stop turning it over in his mind. Between work and taking care of Daisy and her other pups, Jack's thoughts always circled back to that tiny, peculiar creature. Ember had started doing things that made Jack's skin prickle. Small things at first, bringing objects he hadn't asked for, watching him in a way that felt too knowing. But as time passed, the behaviors became more pronounced. Ember was no longer just observing. It was interacting. Jack first noticed it when he left a book on the coffee table. It was one of his old hiking guides, the kind he hadn't opened in years. Jack had pulled it out of the shelf earlier, intending to flip through it, but got distracted. When he returned to the living room later that day, he found Ember sitting by the book, its small paw resting on the cover. As Jack approached, Ember lifted the paw, shifted the book slightly, and then stared at him. It wasn't just a random action. Jack could feel it. Ember had moved that book deliberately. "You want me to look at this?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ember made that soft, melodic sound again. Not a bark, not a whimper, just a faint hum. Jack hesitated, then picked up the book and opened it. He flipped through the pages, glancing down at Ember occasionally. The pup watched him intently, its amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack frowned. "What are you trying to tell me?" Ember didn't respond. It just sat there, still and patient. Jack set the book down and shook his head. He felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was close. The next day, Ember did something even stranger. Jack was repairing an old chair in the garage, his tools spread out on the workbench. Daisy was lounging nearby, her two normal pups curled up at her side. Ember was in its usual spot, watching. Jack needed a particular screwdriver. He turned to grab it, but before his hand reached the tool, Ember was already moving. The pup hopped off its perch and padded over to the workbench. It sniffed the screwdriver, nudged it slightly, then looked up at Jack. Jack froze. "No way," he whispered. Ember nudged the screwdriver again, pushing it closer to the edge of the workbench. Jack reached out slowly and picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, Ember sat back and made that same soft sound. Jack's heart was pounding. "You're doing that on purpose, aren't you?" Ember blinked once, then turned and walked back to its spot. It settled down, curling up as if nothing had happened. Jack stood there, the screwdriver in his hand, his mind racing. This wasn't just a smart dog. This wasn't just a fluke. Ember was responding. Ember understood. The next few days passed in a blur. Jack kept testing Ember, asking it to bring things, watching how it moved, how it reacted. Every time, Ember responded exactly as if it knew what Jack wanted. It didn't need commands. It didn't need training. It just knew. Jack started keeping notes. He jotted down every strange behavior, every interaction, trying to make sense of it. He wrote down the times Ember's eyes seemed to glow brighter, the moments when that warm, humming sensation filled the room. He couldn't explain any of it, but he couldn't ignore it either. One night, Jack sat at the kitchen table, his notebook spread open before him. Ember was lying on the floor nearby, its eyes half closed but still alert. Jack tapped his pen against the table. staring at his notes. "All right, Ember," he said aloud. "You're not a normal dog, I get that. But what are you? Where did you come from?" Ember lifted its head, watching him. The glow in its eyes flickered, just for a moment. Jack leaned forward. Can you understand me?" Ember tilted its head. Jack hesitated. "If you understand what I'm saying, come here." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Ember stood and walked over to him. It sat down at his feet, looking up at him calmly. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "You do understand," he murmured. "Don't you?" Ember didn't move. It just sat there, waiting. Jack reached down and touched the top of its head. The warmth was still there, that steady pulse of heat that seemed to run deeper than the pup's skin. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sensation wash over him. When he opened his eyes again, Ember was staring up at him with those bright, glowing eyes. Jack swallowed hard. He didn't know what this meant. He didn't know what Ember was or why it had come into his life. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a dog. This was something else. Jack leaned back in his chair, his hand still resting lightly on Ember's head. "I don't know what you are," he said softly, "but I'll figure it out. I promise." Ember made that soft, musical sound again, almost as if it understood. Jack had always known the woods behind his house were a little unusual. They were quiet in a way that didn't seem normal, the air often feeling heavy, almost expectant. But in all his years of hiking those trails, he had never come across anything that truly unsettled him. Until Ember. It had been weeks since he'd first found Daisy and her pups out there, and in that time, Jack's life had shifted in ways he could never have imagined. His days were now marked by careful observation, by the constant hum of questions he couldn't answer. Ember's presence wasn't just unusual. It felt purposeful. Daisy and the other pups were as normal as could be, playful and curious, stumbling over each other in their excitement to explore the world. But Ember was something else. Jack couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't just a matter of intelligence or early development. This was something entirely different, something beyond what he could understand. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the woods turned shadowy and dim, Jack sat on the porch with Ember at his side. The pup was always near him now, following him from room to room, watching him with those strange, glowing amber eyes. Jack had given up on rationalizing it. Ember wasn't just a dog. Ember was something more, something that seemed to defy explanation. Jack sipped his coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding him in the moment. He stared out at the tree line, at the dark shapes that shifted in the fading light. The woods had always been his place of solace, a retreat from the noise of the world. But now, every time he looked out there, he felt a strange pull, a whisper in the back of his mind. "You came from there," Jack said softly, not really expecting an answer. He glanced down at Ember, who was sitting upright, alert. "Didn't you?" Ember tilted its head, the soft hum Jack had come to associate with the pup filling the air. It was a sound that seemed to resonate in his chest, warm and steady. Jack set down his coffee and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know what you are," he said, "but I think it's time we find out." The woods were dark and quiet as Jack stepped into the undergrowth, a flashlight in one hand and Ember trotting at his side. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a sign, a clue, something that would explain why Daisy had been out here, alone and vulnerable, and why one of her pups was unlike any animal Jack had ever seen. Ember stayed close, moving with a quiet confidence that Jack couldn't help but find unnerving. The pup never hesitated, never stumbled. It was as if it knew exactly where they were going. Jack tightened his grip on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick shadows. "All right, buddy," Jack muttered. "Lead the way." The deeper they went, the more Jack felt the woods change. The air grew heavier, the silence more profound. It was the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jack paused, shining the light ahead. The trees seemed to crowd closer together, their gnarled branches forming an almost tunnel-like path. Ember stopped, sitting down and looking up at Jack. The pup's glowing eyes reflected the beam of the flashlight, making them seem even brighter, more otherworldly. Jack swallowed hard. "Is this it?" The hum returned, faint but unmistakable. Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward. The path narrowed, the undergrowth growing thicker. Jack pushed aside branches, the light bobbing as he moved. Ember stayed close, never straying more than a few steps away. Jack's mind raced with questions. What was he expecting to find? Another animal like Ember? Some strange, hidden phenomenon? He didn't know, but he couldn't turn back now. The flashlight beam caught on something ahead, a glint of light that made Jack pause. He raised the flashlight higher, his heart pounding. At first, he thought it was just another rock, smooth and glistening with dew, but as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a small, perfectly smooth sphere, about the size of a baseball, nestled in the crook of a tree's roots. The surface was metallic, yet it seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Jack crouched down, the beam steady on the object. Ember sat beside him, perfectly still. "What the hell is this?" Jack whispered. He reached out, hesitating for a moment, then placed his hand on the sphere. The warmth was immediate, a gentle heat that spread through his palm and up his arm. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unmistakably strange. Jack's breath caught as the sphere began to hum, a low vibration that matched the sound Ember made. Jack looked at the pup, whose eyes were fixed on the sphere, their glow intensifying. "Is this where you came from?" Jack asked, his voice barely audible. The sphere's hum grew louder, the heat in Jack's hand becoming more pronounced. He pulled his hand back, staring at the object as if it might come to life. Ember didn't move, its gaze unwavering. Jack straightened, taking a step back. The woods felt different now, as if the very air had changed. He glanced down at Ember, then back at the sphere. "What do I do with this?" The answer didn't come from Ember. It came from within Jack himself. A sudden, overwhelming certainty that he needed to leave the sphere where it was. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't meant to be taken. It belonged here, in these woods, hidden and untouched. Jack nodded slowly. "All right, we leave it." He turned away from the sphere, the flashlight casting its beam back toward the path they had come. Ember followed without hesitation, as if it understood. The hum faded behind them as they moved, the air growing lighter with each step. When they emerged from the woods, the sky was a deep, endless blue, the stars glittering faintly above. Jack looked down at Ember, who was sitting calmly at his side. The pup's eyes were no longer glowing. and the hum was gone. Jack felt a strange sense of peace, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. "Guess we got our answer," Jack said quietly. Ember looked up at him, its gaze steady and calm. Jack crouched, resting a hand on the pup's head. "You're not just a dog," he said softly. "But that doesn't matter. You're mine, and we're in this together." Ember's soft, melodic sound filled the air. Not a hum this time, but something gentler, almost like a sigh. Jack smiled faintly, his fingers brushing over the pup's dark fur. The two of them turned toward the house, leaving the woods and its strange secrets behind. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt certain that everything would be okay. Ember might be different, might always be different, but it didn't change what mattered most. They were family, and they were home.